All right. Well, we'll get started, at least for the recording's sake, but this is going to be a webinar discussing the most recent 2023 admission cycle and how it's kind of affected international students moving forward, international families. So it's me, myself, Josh Davis, your co-host here, along with Sam Harris.
Yeah, excited to be talking about it tonight.
And essentially, we're both college counselors in the international space, working with international students. And we just wanted to kind of share some of our takeaways from the current cycle that's not entirely done just yet. Trying to kind of give some information and insight out to parents and students who, obviously are going through the process right now. They're going to be applying in the years ahead, and kind of, some information that they can use as part of their own process. Maybe a little bit of inspiration, maybe some what not to do, even though typically we try to avoid those and let kids know ahead of time. But this current cycle it's been a lot, right, Sam? It's in terms of not just the numbers and the emotions involved with it, but just a lot of new things going on, a lot of new information. So again, we just want to make sure that parents and students have access to this.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a lot that's changing at the minute for international applicants. So it's definitely good to look back on this cycle and kind of reflect on the numbers that have come out, but also kind of the trends that we've noticed working with students, and then think about how that can impact students applying in future cycles.
Yeah, and again, we're gonna, obviously we have a lot of different webinars at ESM, discussing a number of things. So, we've had College Quest where we kind of break down what the process looks like. We'll have webinars about testing, things like that. So this webinar is a little bit more focused. Again, kind of just talking about the takeaways from this current cycle. So we won't kind of explain in detail a number of things that maybe on other webinars we might do, just for everyone's time. But we do have, a library of webinars that you can find on our website, on our YouTube channel. So please always kind of, make use of those. And we will send a recording of this as well out alongside a slide deck with kind of the data points that we're going to go over a little bit. But this is more of a conversation between me and Sam that we're just going to record and share with the world.
Sounds good, Josh.
Okay, so as Sam said, some of it's going to be data driven, some of it's going to be more anecdotal in terms of the takeaways. But from a data standpoint, what have you kind of seen, Sam, so far?
Yeah, definitely there's a huge trend in increase in attention on the US coming from international applicants. So working with students, I've had more and more students come and ask me, what is it like to apply to the US? Is it something I should consider? But I think that's also borne out in the data that the Common App's released recently. So they've published their deadline update at the beginning of March, which doesn't necessarily paint the full picture of this application cycle, but does give a pretty good indication of trends like applicant numbers. And so what we've seen there is that the international applicant pool, at least via the Common App, has increased since the 2019 to 2020 cycle by 55%, which is a really big increase versus domestic applicants, so students from the US applying, has increased only by 18%. So it's definitely becoming more enticing, perhaps, for international applications, but also something which is becoming increasingly more and more competitive.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, when we started doing this, 10 years ago or so with ESM, I thought at the time that the numbers those were the highest at that point, right? It's like more and more kids every year applying to the US, and especially coming from the UK, where we were based. You saw that number was about like 10,000 kids were applying or so to the US every year. And again, applications and enrollment are kind of two different numbers, right? But we're talking specifically applications. And of course, that means, the more and more applications that come in every year, the admissions officers reading the applications, it's more work for them. But also maybe they're more familiar with, the things that they're reading and the systems that they're kind of learning about, whether it's A-levels in the UK, whether it's IB and things of that nature. So now they're able to kind of evaluate, I think, students, in a much better fashion, and we can kind of see more trends as well on that front. But like you said, 55% increase, since 1920, which was that kind of COVID year. Yeah. And obviously we thought, okay, we're going to see some real skewing of the numbers over the next year or so. And it did jump up, I think, 10,000 applicants that following year. And then another big jump, but it kind of keeps on going, right? And there is no oh, this is because of COVID or the pandemic, or this, it's just more and more people wanting to go to the US for university.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the knock-on effect of that is applicant pools for a specific university, for example, in some cases are still growing to new record highs. So for this last cycle, for example, there are universities who are still reporting that they've broken records, even if the year before they broke records that year with their total applicant numbers. So NYU, obviously very popular, right in the heart of New York City. They've broken a record this year with almost 120,000 applicants for their incoming class. Schools like, the University of Pennsylvania and Dartmouth, Ivy's also breaking records. But Josh, I think the other thing that's really interesting is, I think sometimes it's easy to generalize about application trends and say it's always increasing. These pools are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But actually, interestingly, we've seen some schools start to normalize a little bit in terms of the numbers of applications they're receiving this cycle. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I mean, Harvard, right? Like it's like all these trends are, and I think it comes back to when we meet admissions officers or kind of talk to them, and they'll come over and they'll host events and talks, and their whole job as admissions officers to like almost market the school, be ambassadors for that university, right? And there are some of them who are on the road all the time. There are some schools that have more resources to that, and they're like, okay, like that's what we want. Go find us more international students. Go find more applicants. We want to grow that pool. We do know that international students tend to be full pay, right? So from like a business standpoint, it also kind of makes sense to attract international students. So you can see how some schools are dedicating more resources to that. And then you have Harvard and, Barnard, for example. I think that was the one we had kind of written down, where the numbers decreased by a couple thousand, right? Or a few hundred even. And I'm wondering if they're in that office, are they like, hey, like this is a bad thing, or just like, okay, hey, like, do we really care how many more applicants we get as long as the acceptance rate is still very selective? I mean, that's where there's different kind of focuses, I think, in different offices.
Yeah, what I found really interesting was I was reading Barnard's application summary update, and they were saying that even though their application totals are down slightly versus last cycle, they were saying it was still the most selective or competitive year of admissions yet. So I think universities are still really interested in keeping their admissions numbers low, looking selective, being elite and attractive. But I don't think maybe just looking at one number, for example, like this cycle's admissions totals, tells the whole picture. So it's definitely worth kind of really looking into that. What does it mean for a school to be 3% acceptance rate, right? What does it actually mean for a school to be 6% acceptance rate? And I think breaking that down into different decision deadlines is also really important when students are thinking about how to plan their applications and target their applications and use the data to their advantage. We've seen this in past cycles, but in this cycle as well, that it is advantageous statistically for students to be applying in the early cycles, but especially early decision, right? That makes a big difference.
Yeah, and again, if we use NYU as an example, because I like NYU a lot in the terms of it's a private school, it's very attractive, it's obviously urban campus, they have the ED, they have the ED2, they're very, very selective, and they're kind of, the tier one, arguably tier one and a half, whatever you want to call it, right? But it's a very good school, very selective, not for everyone. But the fact that they can now garnish over 100,000 applications, the things like, you just know they're not reading those, right? You just know they're not reading 100,000 applications, 120,000 applications, actually.
Yeah.
Again, going back to like 7-8 years ago, we used to say that if you're like a 30 on the ACT, that was kind of the magic number to get into NYU, right? And again, that's not like an actual fact, but it was just, that's what the stats and the trend said, that if you had 30 ACT and you did an ED to NYU, your chance of getting in were very high. And now all of a sudden we're seeing, the average SAT, and again, we'll talk about SAT in a second here, but it was around like 15, 20 now for NYU in terms of like, the rank in the middle 50%. It's like that, there's a big difference there too, right? Oh, the more applicants we have, like, so we can be more selective, but also we can raise kind of the crop of like the average student, right? And all of a sudden it makes that bar even higher to get into, where you can no longer say, oh, if you get a 30 on the ACT, like that's, that's good enough for NYU. So it kind of means that like all the schools that and again, I don't really go by rankings, but schools that are maybe in the conversation, the next kind of tier, they're now raised up because the more, the higher kind of graded students are kind of going out for, for NYU as opposed to using it as a safety and things like that. And again, it's just shifting a lot along the spectrum in terms of like, what's a reach, right?
Yeah.
What's a target? What's a safety? I mean, at this point, I'd say anything below 10% acceptance rate is a high reach. And that's where NYU is now, right? 8% admit rate, right? Northeastern, 7%, USC, 7%. These were historically schools where they were in the 20%, 30%, and you could feel pretty decent about your chances. And now, they are like, hey, you have to consider this as like an ED, or obviously USC doesn't even do ED. But like, how do you show this is like your first choice? So it affects their strategy. That's how I look at the data and I'm like, okay, like we got to really take it in context, because even what we try to say about, okay, forget 100,000 applicants, but in terms of the kids applying from your school, right? Yeah. Let's say 10 kids from your school apply. Are you one of the 10? Are you like at the top of the, are you in the top 10% top like your own class? Like these are the things that also matter. And it's like, if you're not in the top 10% of your own class, well, then you extrapolate that to like your city, your country. As an international student, it just becomes harder to kind of, get your application read, I'm going to say, right? And kind of keep up with all these other kids who have really strong applications, because, there's just so many now.
Yeah, definitely. I've heard a lot of people recently saying things like, there's no such thing as a safety school in the US anymore. And I think that that is based on these numbers that are coming out of admissions data. But I also think it might be more appropriate to say there are still safety schools, but it's maybe not the same schools that we used to think of as safety schools. And NYU is a really good example there with that.
Yeah, I think one piece of data that you picked up. So Duke is another, phenomenal school, right? And I think Duke had like 50,000 applications last cycle, right? Mm-hmm. And then this cycle, 49,500. So 500 less. But I also look at it, it's like, this cycle doesn't control, like the kids who apply this year don't really impact the kids who apply next year. Like those kids are necessarily like, oh, we're going to follow in their footsteps. But the fact that the data still tends to be in the same ballpark, it's almost strange to me, right? It's like they just kind of know what they're doing. These schools are set up in a way where they know what they're doing, they know what to expect. The thing that it's harder to predict is the yields.
Yeah.
Right. That's the part where, and again, yield, something I probably will have to define. So if a school accepts 1,000 students and 800 enroll, that's an 80% yield, right? It's how many kids actually matriculate to the university. And that's another number that in terms of like data reporting is very, very important, because, okay, you get a lot of applications, how many kids are you admitting and how many kids are actually showing up, right? Those are kind of the major numbers. And that's where, again, that ED kind of comes in. And I think, you mentioned Duke 6% total admit rate, but then when you kind of break that down even further, the regular decision was like 4.8%, and then the ED was 16.4, right? So you're 3 times more likely to get in early decision to Duke than regular decision. Mm-hmm. That to me is a very important data, right? That's something that's actually actionable to like, okay, I have to really put some thought into this.
Yeah. I think when I work with students, I tend to say, like, just for peace of mind, it's really nice to aim for an early deadline, right? You've got the work out the way, you can continue on with your curriculum, especially if you're doing public exam type subjects where you've got to focus on revision and, finishing up your courses. But there's also a competitive advantage that can't be ignored, especially in the decision programs. So really carefully thinking about, okay, well, is this the right fit for me? And if it is, then really, really doubling down and applying early decision, because especially for places like Duke, and it's a really good example, it makes a meaningful difference applying early versus, waiting for January to roll around and submitting a regular deadline application.
Yeah, and we're also, we're cognizant of the fact, I guess, right, that in the early decision pool, there will be, the athletes, right? A lot of athletes kind of apply in that pool and kind of get their process out of the way. There'll also be a lot of legacies, right? Because it's kind of understood that if you are a legacy, which means obviously if your parent or grandparent or sometimes sibling attended the university, your legacy, that your best chance of getting in is applying early. And when we come back to my anecdotes, I can say once again that that's probably pretty accurate. But obviously not everyone has that connection. So it's not fair to say, oh, that's the strategy. But yes, legacies, athletes, institutional priorities, right? First generation kind of applicants, they kind of get favorable treatment in that early round. So then someone might say, well, like, if I'm going to be kind of below those kind of applicants, what is the point? It's still stronger than regular decision, right? It's still you committing to the university and saying, if I get in, I'm coming. It's you still guaranteeing that you're going to become, a 4-year student at that school. So it still holds a lot of weight. I did hear though from a couple schools, including Carnegie Mellon this year, they literally told students, oh, like if you apply ED or regular decision at Carnegie Mellon, it's not much of a difference, right? And the kids were like, whoa, like everything we've heard is kind of said the opposite, especially with early decision. Early action is a different thing, right? But early decision, it's like, that almost makes, then why offer early decision if you're not really going to create an advantage? Because obviously as a kid, student, you're going to want to have that optionality if it's in your best interest. But we always tell kids like increased probability is probably in your best interest, right? So kind of shifting that, and if anyone hears a plan in Carnegie Mellon early decision, it's like, wait, what? That's something that they've said. Is it a 100% fact? Hard to say. I think the acceptance rate was like 3 or 4% difference, as opposed to, like we said with Duke, like a 12% difference.
Josh, speaking of keeping options open, I think this is something that is really important for international students to think about if they're applying dual track, or if they're applying to UCAS and US and Canada, or and Hong Kong and Japan, wherever they're looking at applying. Can you just talk about how binding early decision is? Because I often get students say, listen, I really want to go to Cambridge, but I've heard if I do ED in the US, it gives me a better chance of getting in. So should I do it? What's your wisdom on that one?
Yeah, it's definitely binding, right? Like it's definitely a thing where it's not a tool that you can kind of use in the game and kind of just be like, oh, it doesn't have any kind of consequences. Like, someone asked once, is it legally binding? Will I go to jail? It's like, no, you probably won't go to jail, right? But your school might get like blacklisted from like any future chance of admissions. They might contact another school and say, hey, this student, signed a contract. Because again, it is a contract that the student, the parents, and the high school sign that say like this student will attend if they're accepted. So, there's definitely that hanging over it. It's never something I encourage, right? To just like kind of squander the ED and kind of see what happens. If the case comes where someone says, hey, I prefer Oxbridge, or I prefer UCAS school or somewhere else to the US, then just do early action and regular decision, right? And kind of understand, hey, the chances might be a little bit lower, but I don't say it's just like the right thing to do. It kind of just works out when you do it that way. If you do ED and you plan on backing out, it just creates more of a mess. It creates more stress. Kids feel like they're doing something kind of wrong, that they might get caught. It's just not really, really worth it, to be honest. The one kind of wrinkle there is if you apply ED somewhere and you do somehow get financial aid, or that's like, the expectation you're going to get some financial aid, and the financial aid package doesn't come back, attractive enough, and you literally cannot afford the school, then you can kind of get out of it. But again, that's kind of a very unique,
Yeah.
I would say.
I don't think I've ever seen that with any of my students. I've definitely seen instances where we have like lots and lots of serious conversation leading up to applications, thinking about, is it right to do decision because of the improved chances, or is it actually better to keep more options open and allow a student to have the choice of either going somewhere in the UK, going somewhere else internationally, and having a wider range of options. On the other hand, I've seen a lot of students who know for a fact they want to go somewhere and they apply ED and they get in and the process is done and they have a great Christmas. So that's also, if it's right for a student, I think it can be a really, really good way of going.
Yeah, and every year I kind of wish that more students had that option, had that, not just that option, but they all have the option, but they actually like use the option, and then it works out right, where it's like, hey, December 15th, like you said, I'm done. Like I don't have to do, yes, I've worked on other applications. I don't have to submit anything else. I don't have to worry about anything else, right? And sometimes it does mean, I don't want to say aiming less ambitiously. That's not the point, because obviously, like if you Duke ED, Dartmouth ED, Penn ED, those are all very ambitious. But obviously, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, early action single choice, right? They don't offer early decision, so you're kind of like forced to kind of keep playing the longer game. But then when I have kids who ED to, like we said, at NYU or BC or Northeastern or BU, they the statistics are much higher, right? The chance of getting in are much higher. And obviously, if you are, hey, I'm the top student in my entire school, I want to aim for the most selective schools, I get it, right? But for kids who maybe don't have flawless academic profiles, right? Or maybe they don't have the time or the ability to commit to extracurriculars and develop that side of the profile. And we kind of, hey, like there are some gaps here in this application in terms of like, there are other students who are just more competitive, right? Other students are more appealing. That's just the reality of it. Therefore, if you do ED to a school that you like, and I said the big thing, right? Like if you like the school, if you could see yourself going there, if it's literally one of your first choices and you know that EDing there will really increase the chances of you getting in and you'd be happy to go, you got to take that into consideration, right? It's just, sometimes it can be a little bit humbling. It's like, oh, but like, what if I could have gotten into so-and-so? It's like, sure, like a lot of what ifs, but like, there's a good chance that this is going to happen for you if you do this. Statistically speaking, no guarantees ever, but that's a decision that sometimes we just have to really come to together.
Yeah, definitely. I'm just thinking, Josh, about your mention of students who might not have perfect academic profiles, and ways in which they might use this data from the last cycle to increase their likelihood of.
Sorry, I cut out there for me for a second.
I can hear you again.
There we go.
It's all right. Yeah.
Right.
Sorry, I was just saying that using ED can be, as you said, a really good way of maximizing your opportunity, even if your academic profile isn't perfect, because it's, there are lots of really competitive students, but not everyone has perfect grades, perfect test scores. But I also think we should probably talk about test scores and how that can either help complete the picture of an application or, as many universities are still test optional, perhaps be part of the decision-making process as well, whether or not to actually take those tests or at least submit the scores. I mean, it'd be great if students could aim to take the tests, right? For international students, especially with predicted grades coming out of the A-level system or IB, it's really important that you have solid data to sit next to your application to, prove to admissions officers that you've got the academic stuff to succeed. But at the minute, I think, is it 4%, maybe only 4% of universities who accept common application are requiring standardized testing. So that seems on paper like maybe we don't have to do it. What's your advice to your students on that one?
Yeah, I think, we're always conscious that we don't want to put more on students' plates, right? But it's just such an opportunity, right, to separate yourself from, again, the tens of thousands of other applicants who probably will see that it's test optional and decide, oh, okay, like there's no point. I don't think I can get a high score or competitive score. I don't really want to put in the hours. They're going to, put me in the position to do that. A lot of kids think that way, right? So where I come in is like, hey, if you have a chance to like put some time work in and get a good score, like you'll be able to probably leverage it. And then if you do get to a position where like, hey, my score is good for some schools, not so good for other schools, again, that's worthwhile. And again, if you realize after a little while that, hey, like I'm not going to get to a competitive score, then right? You've kind of given it a shot and then you can kind of move on. So it makes sense kind of. Then the second piece of it is whether you submit the scores or not. And that's another thing that's kind of changed, kind of with the current landscape is like, all right, my score is 20 points below like the the 25th percentile, right? Like, do I send that? You'll hear different takes on it. Again, depends on your grades, right? Do you have really, really strong grades? So, okay, well, maybe you don't need the test score as much to boost it. But if your grades are, slipping any kind of way, then the score might show them like, hey, at least you are, on the right track, things like that. So there's always context involved, I think. That's why you have to make the decisions on a case-by-case basis. From my own data of the kids who applied this year, so, a couple dozen, we'll say, right? The majority did have test scores for sure. but I will say that a couple were able to get into a tier 1 school without submitting test scores, right? So it does give me a little bit of hope that, like, if a student's like, hey, like, I'm test anxious, I'm a phenomenal student, I do a lot of great things, that test scores are going to be really hard for me to do. Like, I don't want, please don't let me have to do this, right? Those kind of students, and if they know, okay, that time that they'd be dedicating to usually prep would be dedicated to other things, then it's okay, and they still have a chance, right? Like, and I can say that, like, they still have a chance. You have a better chance with the high score. Like, it's just that simple.
Yeah. Universities are saying, okay, well, if you don't submit test scores, then we'll put more weight on the other elements of your application, right? So the students who I've seen succeed at the highest level without test scores are students who are working on really impactful projects or developing their activities profile in a significant way outside of the classroom and outside of like a formally academic setting. So I think that's really important as well, is evaluating, okay, well, if I'm not going to go the testing route, or if I've tried the testing and actually based on my scores, it doesn't make sense to submit, then what's going to fill that gap, right? What else is going to impress the admissions officers, if not, a competitive test score? And I think, I had a student who tried her best for testing, really put a lot of effort into it, was aiming for Stanford, where she's actually has been admitted and is going to attend in the fall. And she said, I can't send them. They're not good enough. And instead developed a really kind of impactful Google Chrome extension that she's taken a year out now. That's why she's going to start in the fall. She's taken a year out now to kind of manage that business. So I think it's important that students understand not everyone has to create an app or a Google Chrome extension, but you do want to give a persuasive reason why an admissions committee should take your application seriously. And Josh, I think, we talk a lot with our students about having a kind of hook to your application, and that becomes even more important if you're going to go to test.
Yeah. And again, just the last kind of piece on the testing, obviously the digital SAT now for international students is another factor, right? So if you're class of 2024 beyond, and kind of going through the process right now, you got to consider that, like, okay, should I be taking the SAT or the ACT? And the first feedback we've gotten from the digital SAT that took place in March, I think like March 11th, the scores were probably a little bit higher than, anticipated, in terms of, like, I wouldn't say than anticipated, but kids were very happy with their scores, which is obviously great. That's all I care about. Like, oh, are you happy? You feel good? Yes, your prep has kind of paid off. Or is it that the test maybe is a little bit easier than they used to be, or there's still question marks and doubts maybe involved, right? Which makes me nervous, because again, if I'm nervous and I don't know kind of how to read a score, the admissions officer might kind of feel the same way about it, right? As many times the College Board can kind of reassure that no, it's the same scores. It's like, well, a kid all of a sudden went from like a 1400 to 1500 just from taking the new test, right? So, again, the ACT hasn't changed since they've gone computer-based, 5-6 years ago. So those scores are very, very solid. Most schools do super score at this point. They might word it very, it's like cryptic at this point in their testing policies on the website. But essentially they're saying, like, hey, just send us, your best sectional scores and your highest composite score, but they'll see, the highest of each, right? And also we can kind of self-report for most schools, directly to the Common App. So we can control a little bit more of what they do see. So again, we always encourage kids to take the test multiple times. If you don't do well, okay, doesn't mean anyone ever, they don't have to ever see it. Like, you can still go test optional. So that's the mindset that I want kids to have when they go through.
Yeah, definitely. Just a last bit on test optional. The other thing I think is really important for students who are looking at applying in the future is to just really keep up to date with the testing policies at the universities they're interested in, because it's not the case that universities which have been test optional this cycle will necessarily be test optional forever, right? Like, a lot of schools have been rolling that over on a year-by-year basis since COVID, and there's only a few who've stepped out and said they're going to be test optional, not permanently, but indefinitely, right? So I think keeping an eye on that's really important as well. Like, Vassar, for example, has come out recently and said we're test optional indefinitely, but otherwise you want to be doing some really good research into what the testing policy is for your application year, because it might not be the case that a school which is test optional this year is test optional 3, 4, 5 years down the road.
Yeah, and for anyone wondering, Georgetown, MIT, they need those scores now already. They're like, test optional is just not the way that we're going to go about it. So, again, schools have different approaches, and you got to respect that. And if Georgetown's your first choice, start your test prep, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of like some more kind of takeaways from this cycle, and again, this is specifically speaking about international students. You know, what's great about the work that we do is that we work with kids in the A-level system, kids in the IB system, kids in the kind of American school AP system. I have a couple kids in the French system, in the Swiss system, Mexican, Italian system. So I have a lot of different experiences with different systems. If you're from a system that's like more niche, so in this case, we'll say like the Swiss or the Mexican system, where even if you have like high marks, they don't have enough, I guess, like precedent or data to be like, oh, like this is what this means. Like you are kind of this tier of student, you're capable of this level of work. You got to be aware of that. And that's where, I have a few students who are taking, APs kind of on their own, right? As like an additional kind of proof that like, hey, I can handle, rigorous academic work in America. For those in the A-level system, what I notice is that it's kind of easier to be at the top, right? Like, again, for kids that go to really, I won't say prestigious, but like independent boarding schools, or just good schools, you tend to see that like a high percentage of kids have A to A stars, right? And again, that data is available, so a school can see that like, oh, like 85% of the kids at the school have A or A stars, or have, above 7s in GCSEs. If you're applying from a school that has like 53% of the kids get A to A stars, and you do have an A star, does that help you or hurt you, you think, right? Because it's like, that means that yes, you're better than the most, but is the quality of the education high enough, right? Like there's kind of these questions that come into play. What have you kind of noticed, obviously being at rugby? Can I say that? Sorry.
That's okay. No. I
But
think
yeah,
also, yeah,
evaluating like, okay, you have all these kids with high A stars and A's, and what do you kind of, how do you sift through that?
yeah, definitely. So I don't have large scale data on this. I just have kind of, my anecdotal experience. But what I've noticed is, and I guess this is true of applications from all curriculums, really. It absolutely does matter if you're looking at highly selective schools, the most selective schools in the country. It does matter that you're taking the most demanding course load as well at your school, at your secondary school. So for A levels, for example, I've seen students receive way, way, way more impressive admissions offers if they're studying 4 A levels, for example, than if they're studying 3, because they had the option to take 4, even though the majority of students only end up sitting 3 papers or 3 subjects. So I think it's really important to understand not just how US universities view your curriculum, but also how your curriculum in the school that you're enrolled in is actually applied and is followed by the students enrolled in that school, because that's a really quick way to make yourself stand out as well. Okay, well, I had the option to do 4 and I chose to do 4 and I stuck with 4. Great, especially if 80%, 90% of the students in that school are only doing 3, because it's kind of common. So I think for me, that's been the most important takeaway in the last few cycles. Is it is a challenge to have a harder course load, but obviously if you meet that challenge, it says something. It's persuasive.
Exactly. And I am here to be the like, well, there's some kids, kids who have the option to take 4 and they take 3 because they say 9% of kids take 3. I'm like, you gotta be in the 10%.
Yeah.
Right. Or hey, like there's a couple kids in my school who take 5 A levels. It's like, okay, well, just understand that if an admissions officer is reading applications and sees that this kid has 5 A levels, which might mean 1 off timetable because they wanted to learn Russian or Mandarin or whatever it may be, like that's probably going to come off impressive, right? And again, the first thing they look at is that rigorous course load. But again, like, and the other thing is, by virtue of admissions officers seeing so many kind of A's and A stars, it means that if you do have a B, all of a sudden you are kind of like at a disadvantage, right? Whereas someone in the AP system, where there's just kind of, you can take 10 plus APs over multiple years, right? You can take literally, some kids will have 14 different classes in a transfer for a year. They'll take 7 one semester and 7 another semester. So 1B on that doesn't really stand out as much. Well, it still stands out, but it's not like held against you as much. If you're taking 4 A levels, a B stands out.
Or even 3 and a B is, yeah.
And it's almost kind of harsh, but the expectation expectation is like, well, we're so used to seeing A's and A stars that like, that's just what we expect, right? And then with the IB, I feel like the IB is obviously it's numerical, and the maximum is 45, and you kind of know like, okay, like 1% of kids get 45, so 44 is still very, very impressive, 43. But then the further you kind of get away from it, it's like, all right, you just kind of know it's getting more and more challenging. And the other thing with the IB is obviously, three higher level, three standard level, that's the norm. If your school lets you take 4 higher levels, you got to consider it.
Yeah.
Right. All these kind of the margins are so thin. So anything you can do to kind of stand out, we do encourage. And if it feels too much, like overwhelming, that's probably a good realization to have earlier rather than later. Because then you can be like, okay, like if that was overwhelming now, that probably means we need to focus on, not MIT and Stanford necessarily, right? So I think it's always worthwhile to push the rigor early and then assess, okay, like, can I handle it?
Yeah, the harder conversation I've had to have, Josh, is not, okay, this is a really difficult workload. Maybe we should think about dropping a subject or streamlining your commitments. The harder conversation is when students come to me later in the process and they say, my dream is to go to an Ivy League university, and here's my academic workload. Here are the courses I've chosen. And then you say, well, actually, given the options you could have chosen from, it's a little bit kind of less demanding, and it's kind of late to now, halfway through an A-level course, you're not going to just add an additional A-level. That's very challenging. So I think it's important to start with rigor and then walk it back if necessary, rather than come to the process and say, oh, in a couple of years' time, I might think about, competitive US applications, and I might need to then increase my workload, because that's a lot harder to do it that way around.
Another takeaway, just a lot of students internationally that are going for business and for computer science, some for both. And again, that's something where a few years ago, I just didn't see as much of that. Obviously you can assume that AI and things of that nature, and kids like want to be at the forefront. It's like, hey, like we're going to be part of the first kind of crop of students who can, not just incorporate AI into our academic journeys, but actually like study it, prepare for it, kind of, leverage it as we go into our professional careers. So you're just seeing a lot of kids into that. The thing I've seen with CS, specifically computer science, it's like, it's so hard to differentiate yourself in terms of like your ability, right? I've had kids who I was like, you can program in 13 languages. You've, designed all these projects in open source software. You have a GitHub profile. Like you've obviously coded for hours and hours and hours. Great. You have websites. And then they still don't have the results they want, because it's like, well, this other kid actually has like higher level research that they've already published. And it's, well, so all the hours you spent on a computer coding almost felt like it wasn't worthwhile. Like it's hard to quantify, right? And if that's their hook, just understand there probably have to be other layers added to it. Mm-hmm. From the business standpoint, it's not good enough to say like, I want to follow my parents, my mother or father's footsteps, right? Or I want to take over the family business. Those are all nice things, but they're not compelling enough to like, oh, that's why I'm going to accept you. There are literally kids starting businesses all the time now. And it's like, you don't have to be a CEO to be interested in business or a founder or anything like that, but just know, again, that's the competition. Kids are managing school plus other commitments and running businesses, right? Like maybe, it can be small time, some a little bit bigger. Some are more tech focused, so you can do it in kind of the comfort of your own, boarding school dorm. And some are, no, like kids are actually like working and they're on the ground, like making things happen. So again, if you're going to go for a business, just understand what you're kind of up against. And also it's still kind of considered not as scholarly, kind of academic in nature, right? Again, this is just from my own personal experience working with these kind of kids. Sometimes it can feel like it's like, oh, like you just want to make money fast. You don't really care like who it affects or how it affects, as long as you kind of increase your profits. So you have to be very careful about how you angle yourself as like a future business leader, right? Or as an aspiring entrepreneur.
Yeah.
That might.
No, definitely. I've seen so many students in recent cycles want to apply for business. So I think there's lots and lots of competition growing there.
But I will say, if you're kind of coming back to the hook question, if you're clearly on a potential career path of some kind, and you're taking, courses or involved in clubs and societies that kind of like build your skill set and kind of give you new information, and obviously just build your confidence, because you're like, hey, like this is what I want to do. And that can be business focused, entrepreneurship focused. That does help, right? And I've had some kids have success with that, but they can also, apply that mindset to film or to music or to sports. It's like, again, everyone, I want to be a professional football player, great. But if you actually spend hours and hours and hours doing it and opening other doors and then learning other kind of takeaways from it, that's where the holistic nature of the US, admissions process actually gives you the chance to articulate all that, right?
Yeah, definitely. Right. Shall we maybe give some key takeaways before we take some questions?
Yes, and by the way, ladies and gentlemen, there is a Q&A feature here in the webinar that you're able to kind of type up questions that we can kind of get to. So if you have any of those, please feel free to, put them in there now and we'll try to answer them. But, some other kind of takeaways related more to like the hook, right? You mentioned the hook, and the hook again is like, what's that main thing that a student does? It has to be a process, right? A hook is a commitment that, years and years in the making. And whether you become elite at a measurable sport, like, track and field and swimming, or in a niche sport like fencing, or you just play soccer or football, basketball, or anything like that. It's, you don't have to be elite necessarily, but like, if you're dedicating a lot of time to it, something has to come from it, right? You don't have to be an Olympian, but again, it should inform part of like who you are, part of your leadership skills, part of your work ethic, things of that nature. There has to be other takeaways beyond just like, I spend a lot of time doing this, right? Other hooks that I've really liked over the years, well, this year was kids who were consistently committed to uplifting members of their community, right? So whether it's kids in my school, whether it's my local area, it's every week I am doing this thing, I'm committed to it. And again, maybe not between week 1 and 4 do you notice anything, but by week 12, all of a sudden it's like, wow, like this is so much more than I initially thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that kind of platform is so important. And whether you're involved in an activity that teaches you like fundamentally valuable life lessons, whether you start to develop a care for a cause and it kind of leads to a call to action, those are other things where initially it's like, oh, I'm just kind of into this curiosity wise. And then all of a sudden you start getting more involved, and it could be, this year we had kids doing things in fashion, kids doing things in medicine. But the point was they sparked that interest and then they actually pursued it. And by pursuing it, they found things about themselves that they were able to talk about in their essays. And that's the part that I think is like, help them stand out.
Yeah, I always like to explain to students that, like, in my opinion, the most important thing about that hook is that it's impactful, right? And that doesn't mean that it's charitable necessarily. Like, it could be personally impactful, it helps you develop your own perspective on the world. It could be charitable. But I think those are the sorts of projects and those are the sorts of activities that are worth spending your time on and worth developing, so long as you keep an eye on the impact of what you're doing. And I think that sometimes helps students kind of focus a little bit where they spend their extracurricular time.
Yeah, it comes back to what do the universities want, right? They want to admit students who are going to come in, obviously go to class, stay out of trouble, but they're going to give back to their community at school. They're going to get involved in things. They're going to be passionate. They're going to share that passion with others, right? And then maybe they're going to go on and do phenomenal things after university, after using their resources. So, understanding that the more you can convince a school that like, hey, like that's what I'm about. That's who I am. That's how I show up. By obviously like being committed to certain things, or, being able to involve others, right? That's what, leadership, not everyone's a rah leader, but if I can get two of my friends to get involved in my project, I'm a leader, right? That's leadership. That's, I got to make sure that I set up a kind of agenda and set up some goals and, keep people accountable, things like that. And it can be academic in nature. It can be artistic. That's the thing. There's no limit to what you can kind of do with it. Not to mention the schools love duality, right? They love hearing about the student who is into performing arts, but also into STEM, right? And it's like, okay, like how do you bridge those two passions, in your own life? And again, how do you talk about it? So, a lot of my kind of takeaways is like, the more kids buy into what they are passionate about, the more success they have. The kids who are kind of like constantly throwing stuff at the wall, like, oh, like maybe I'll try this, maybe I'll do this, or this kid did this. Oh, Josh, like you told me one of your students did this, and you try to copycat, that's where it gets a little trickier, right? So just kind of appreciate your own individuality, and usually it'll pay off.
Yeah, and I think that's really the one of the main draws for me about applying to the US in the first place. Like that stuff is considered. You know, if you're filling out a UCAS form, for example, it's really hard to highlight your passions and your interests outside of your chosen subject. And I think it's a really important opportunity for students to, you know, develop their own interests and think about where they're headed in the future and to let that really shine through on a university application. And I think for me, there's like a wider takeaway in reflecting back on the last admission cycle, because I think it can sometimes inspire a bit of panic in students and families to look at all of the data and say, oh my gosh, if there were 120,000 applications to NYU, how on earth am I going to stand out? But I think like for me, as you said, Josh, these sorts of data points help develop strategy, but I don't think they're the most important part of a student's application experience, right? Applying to university is so much more than just playing a numbers game. And I really like to remind my students that, right? It's not I've calculated out what my best chances are and this is the way I'm going to play it. It's actually like really reflecting on your personal interests, your strengths, things that you want to develop, and then looking forward to, you know, a 4-year degree where you've got to find a right fit university for yourself, which might not always kind of line up with just the data on paper. So I think it's really important just keep that in perspective that, you know, there's much more to decision making in this process than just the data as well.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So obviously, you know, people are free to always get in touch with us. You know, you can find my email is just josh@esmprep.com. Sam is
S Harris.
Yeah, S Harris at esmprep.com. So always feel free to get in touch with us. You know, again, it's funny we come back to the NYU number because it is globally, right? Those are global applications, and admissions officers are kind of broken into different regions. But I always say, like, kids from London, from Italy, from Spain, from Europe, Middle East, you know, Asia, whatever it may be, like, you have to just assume that I have something worth reading, right? Like, I have things to say, like, I am a right fit for this school. And the more time that you kind of spend, you know, looking into the schools, obviously, if you get a chance to visit, great. Demonstrating interest for some of the universities can have an impact. You know, those are other things that you can kind of consider. But again, takeaway is I had kids get into schools that they never saw, right? That they didn't necessarily have to go to, that they didn't necessarily interact with. And I had kids who spoke to admissions officers like 7 times and had everything flawless, like amazing applications, and didn't get into that school, but then got in somewhere else even better, right? So I don't want to say it's a crapshoot, but it's just not a one size fits all model. That's the key. But we got to make sure we empower students to like embrace their own process. That's honestly the biggest takeaway.
No, definitely. I completely agree.
Okay. All right. Well, it doesn't seem like there's any open questions. So we're probably going to wrap up here in the next 30 seconds or so. Last chance for people to come in with a question. Again, thank you so much for joining. And we will send some visuals alongside the recording of this webinar sometime later this week. So please, you know, keep an eye open for that. And if you have any questions, always feel free to get in touch.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Josh, for joining us in this
All right.
conversation.
Thank you, everyone. All right. Take care.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.